It was supposed to be a quiet summer morning in the Utah canyonlands when Chloe stepped onto her porch, expecting nothing more than a cup of coffee and silence. But within seconds, everything changed. A trembling mountain lion cub emerged from the tree line, eyes wet, placing its tiny paw on her hand as if begging for help. And when it turned toward the distant red cliffs, Chloe understood instantly. Something terrible had happened in the canyon, and she was the only one it could run to. The summer morning light drifted lazily over the red canyon cliffs, washing Chloe Warren's porch in warm gold. She had just stepped outside with her first cup of coffee, hoping for a quiet start to another ordinary day in the Utah backcountry. At 30 years old, she had grown used to this silence, the kind that wrapped around her cabin like a soft blanket, far from the pressure of her old life in the city. Here she found peace, space to breathe, and a slower rhythm that felt almost sacred. But as the sunlight crept across the wooden boards, that tranquility was broken by a sound she had never heard on her property before. A small, trembling cry that rose and fell like the whimper of a frightened child. Chloe froze, her mug halfway to her lips. The cry came again, thinner this time, a soft rasping sound that didn't belong to any animal she recognized. She slowly turned her head toward the edge of the porch steps, and that was when she saw it. A mountain lion cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, standing unsteadily at the foot of the stairs. Its tawny coat glowed under the morning sun, though patches of dirt clung to its fur. The cub's blue-gray eyes were wet, wide, and locked onto hers with a desperation that made her breath stop cold. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cub's tiny chest rose and fell with quick, uneven breaths, and Chloe could hear the faint click of her home security camera capturing the surreal moment. Mountain lions never approached humans, not like this, not in the open, not in daylight. Yet this one lifted a trembling paw, hesitated, and then climbed one step, then another, until it stood only a few feet away. Chloe felt her heartbeat break into a sprint, the kind of jolt she hadn't felt since her first panic attack years ago. But something about the cub's expression pushed fear aside. This wasn't aggression. This was pleading. The cub took another shaky step forward, and before Chloe could react, it gently placed its small paw against her forearm. The touch was feather-soft but electric, sending a chill through her body. She could feel the rough pads beneath its fur, the tremor running through its bones, the warmth of a creature both wild and terrified. "Oh, sweetheart, what happened to you?" she whispered, though she knew it couldn't understand her words. Still, the cub's ears twitched as if it understood her tone. Then it cried again, this time a broken, rasping sound that clawed at Chloe's chest. She had lived near wildlife long enough to recognize distress, but this cry was different. This was the sound of something urgent, something wrong, something that wouldn't wait. The cub backed away a few steps, then looked toward the redwoods at the edge of her property. It glanced at her, then back at the trees, repeating the motion again and again. Chloe realized with a jolt that the little creature wasn't just asking for comfort. It was asking her to follow. Her logical mind pushed back immediately. She knew she should call Utah Wildlife Services, stay inside, and wait. She knew mountain lions were dangerous, even cubs, and somewhere nearby a mother lion was likely watching. But the cub's posture told another story. Its left hind leg trembled under its weight, and she noticed raw scrapes along its thigh, caked with dried sap and dust. It wasn't running to her out of curiosity. It had run to her because it had nowhere else to go, and because whatever had hurt it might still be out there. Chloe's pulse thudded in her ears as a warm gust swept across the canyon, carrying the scent of juniper and dust. The cub whimpered once more, then turned toward the tree line. It took 2 steps, paused, looked back at her, and let out a pleading sound that didn't feel like an animal's cry at all. It felt closer to a child begging for help. In that moment, all Chloe's fears collided with a deeper instinct, the one that always pushed her to act, no matter how frightened she was. Maybe it was compassion, maybe courage, maybe simply the inability to ignore suffering, whether human or wild. She set her coffee mug aside and crouched slightly to appear less threatening. "Okay," she murmured, her voice soft but shaking. "I'm here. I'm listening." She took one cautious step toward the edge of the porch, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't want to entertain. Injured animals, poachers, abandoned traps. She remembered reading articles about illegal wildlife trafficking in the Southwest, about rising incidents of exotic animal poaching across state lines. She never imagined those things could be happening anywhere near her quiet cabin, yet the fear settling in her stomach whispered otherwise. The cub watched her stand up fully, then immediately began to limp toward the trees, pausing every few feet to make sure she followed. Chloe swallowed hard. The canyon felt suddenly vast and unpredictable, a place filled with shadows that might hide dangers she couldn't yet see. But something in that cub's gaze, fragile, urgent, almost human, left her no room to turn away. As she stepped off the porch and onto the sun-warmed ground, the cub let out a soft, relieved sound. And as Chloe followed it into the trees, she felt the strange, unsettling certainty that whatever lay ahead was far bigger and far darker than an injured cub. She just didn't know yet how deep the danger ran, or how much this small creature was counting on her to face it. The little cub moved with a shaky urgency, limping toward the tree line as if every second mattered. Chloe followed slowly at first, still torn between instinct and caution, though the caution was fading with each desperate sound the cub made. The early summer heat was already beginning to rise, softening the red dust beneath her boots. She glanced back toward her cabin only once, as if expecting someone or something to stop her. Nothing did. The porch sat still and quiet, the untouched cup of coffee cooling where she had left it, a reminder of how quickly a peaceful morning could shift into something entirely unknown. As she stepped into the shadow of the junipers, the cub paused and looked up at her with eyes too weary for an animal so young. Chloe crouched beside it, studying the injuries she'd only glimpsed earlier. The raw scrapes on its hind leg looked as though the cub had slid, or been dragged, across rough stone. Sticky patches of dried sap clung to its fur, mixed with fine red dust from the canyon floor. When she touched the fur near one of the scrapes, the cub flinched, but didn't pull away entirely. Pain, exhaustion, fear, but also determination. It was hurt, yes, but still trying to lead her somewhere. She straightened and scanned the ground. The cub's tracks were small and uneven, but another set of tracks ran alongside them, larger, deeper footprints spaced farther apart. Not the mother mountain lion's. These had the rounded heel and tread pattern of a human boot. Chloe's stomach tightened. She had seen hikers pass by her land before, but no one should have been this close to her cabin, and no decent hiker dragged something so heavy it carved a faint groove through the dust and pine needles. As that realization sank in, a warm gust swept through the canyon, stirring loose sand and carrying the scent of sun-baked stone. The cub whined softly and nudged her shin with its small head before limping ahead again. Chloe hesitated only a moment before following it deeper into the trees. She told herself she was only gathering information, only making sure the young lion wasn't walking toward danger. But the truth pulsed under her ribs. She was already too involved to turn back. And if a human was responsible for this cub's injuries, she needed to know. As they walked, the forest changed subtly. The dry, open space behind her cabin gave way to denser growth, pinyon pines, junipers, and tall brush that cracked softly beneath her steps. The shade cooled the air, but it did nothing to calm the knot tightening in her chest. She noticed more signs that something had passed through the area recently. Broken branches, disturbed soil, and a discarded strip of black fabric snagged on a sage bush. She picked it up and turned it over in her fingers. It looked like it was once part of a glove or a strap. She didn't have enough information to understand its significance, but she folded it into her pocket anyway. If someone had laid traps in this area, whether legal or not, she needed to be careful. Utah had laws about wildlife protection, and illegal trapping was a serious offense, something she'd once read about in a wildlife conservation article while browsing for home insurance and outdoor safety tips. The cub stopped again, panting softly. Chloe found herself kneeling beside it without thinking, letting it rest its tiny head against her knee. "You're so brave," she murmured, her voice barely above the whisper of wind through the branches. The cub's breath shuddered, and for a moment she felt the fragile thump of its heartbeat against her leg. She had never allowed herself to be this close to a wild predator before, not even a small one, but something about the cub's innocence tore through every boundary she'd ever held. Then, in the silence that stretched through the canyon, a sound drifted toward them. A distant metallic rattle, sharp, brief, unmistakable, like chain links striking against rock. Chloe's breath hitched. She lifted her head and scanned the dense brush around them, her senses suddenly sharpened. The cub's ears folded back as it pressed closer to her, eyes wide. Another sound followed, softer this time but still metallic, like someone adjusting equipment. Chloe's pulse began to hammer. That wasn't wildlife. That was a human sound. Equipment sound. Something intentional. A sudden gust parted the branches just enough for her to see it. In the distance, half hidden behind a cluster of pinyon pines, a faint trail marked by deeper shoe prints and a second groove in the dirt. The trail led uphill toward a rock outcrop she recognized from a hike months earlier. A narrow path that curved toward Deadmare Canyon. The cub whimpered and took several steps toward that path, glancing back at her with fearful urgency. "Is your family up there?" Chloe whispered, barely allowing herself to imagine the truth. A mother lion was never far from her cubs, unless something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. She followed the cub up the path, the canyon walls rising around them like rust-colored giants. The further they climbed, the more signs she saw. A crushed water bottle, a torn corner of a protein bar wrapper. Fresh prints, the discarded remains of something that smelled faintly of bait. She felt her throat tighten. Whoever had been here wasn't passing through. They were working here. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket, searching for a signal it couldn't find. She pulled it out anyway, staring at the empty bars. If something went wrong up ahead, she would be on her own. The thought twisted her stomach, but she couldn't leave. Not now, not when the cub was watching her like she was its last hope. They reached a small clearing near the outcrop, and Chloe slowed to a halt. The ground was torn up, disturbed by multiple sets of prints, boots, paw marks, and something dragged through the dirt. She knelt, brushing aside, loose dust to reveal a faint patch of reddish-brown staining the stone beneath. Not enough to confirm, but enough to fear. The cub let out a cry so pained, so raw, that it ripped through the quiet like a warning siren. Chloe looked up sharply. Something awaited them ahead, something that had driven this young mountain lion to her porch at dawn, begging in the only way it knew how. As a warm gust swept across the clearing and rustled the junipers, Chloe realized the truth settling like a weight across her shoulders. This wasn't a simple injury. This wasn't an accident of nature. Someone had left a trail of harm in this canyon, and whatever had started this was somewhere up ahead, waiting in the red shadows for her to discover it. The trail narrowed as Chloe followed the cub deeper into the rising canyon walls, their red stone faces glowing warm beneath the late morning sun. The air felt different here, denser, stiller, carrying a weight that made every sound sharper. Even the birds had grown quiet, their silence unsettling against the soft crunch of dirt beneath her boots. The cub limped beside her, stopping only when its breath hitched, then forcing itself forward again, with a resolve that tightened something deep in Chloe's chest. Whatever waited ahead, this tiny survivor was determined to reach it. They approached a rock shelf she vaguely remembered from a hike years earlier, though the path felt altered now, scarred with fresh grooves and broken brush. It wasn't until she knelt to inspect the ground that she saw it clearly. A series of deep boot prints, heavier than any she'd seen earlier, spaced in an uneven rhythm, like someone hauling weight. Beside the prints ran a harsh drag line scoring through sand and stone, as if something large had been pulled against its will. Chloe felt a chill despite the heat. She had seen enough in the outdoors to distinguish hikers from hunters, and hunters from something worse. These prints didn't belong to weekend campers or wildlife photographers. They belonged to people who moved with purpose and without conscience. She lifted her gaze slowly, noticing a faint shimmer ahead, a metallic glint half hidden behind a pinyon pine. She stepped closer, brushing aside a branch, and her breath caught. A trail camera. Not the kind used by researchers or rangers, but a newer model favored by private hunters, high-resolution, motion-activated, and far more expensive than the average backcountry hobbyist would invest in. She recognized it because she had once seen a similar model advertised on an outdoor recreation site while researching home security upgrades. The difference was striking. Legitimate wildlife cameras were usually mounted openly for monitoring or study. This one was tucked deep into the foliage, positioned at a low angle toward the narrowest section of the path. Someone wanted to see who, or what, walked through Dead Mare Canyon. Someone was watching. As she backed away, a low rumble echoed faintly from somewhere above. Thunder? A vehicle? The canyon distorted sound, bending it into something ghostly. The cub flinched and pressed itself against her leg, tail low, eyes fixed ahead. That was when Chloe noticed another disturbing detail. Caught beneath a thorned sagebush was a strip of nylon webbing, frayed at one end. A harness strap? A piece of gear? She tugged it free and studied the stamped lettering. Most of it was worn away, but she could make out part of a manufacturer's name, one she recognized from reading consumer reports on hunting equipment. None of this was casual. None of it was accidental. The cub tugged at her pant leg, urging her forward. Chloe nodded, though her nerves tightened like wires under her skin. The landscape shifted again as they climbed. The trees grew more spaced, replaced by jagged rocks and dry brush that crunched sharply underfoot. The wind funneled through the canyon, carrying the dusty scent of ironstone and something else, something faint, metallic, unpleasant. They reached a narrow ledge overlooking a shallow drop. The cub stopped abruptly, lowering its body, ears pinned back. Chloe followed its gaze and felt the air freeze in her lungs. Below them, the clearing was torn apart as if some violent struggle had happened there. The dirt was churned, rocks overturned, brush flattened. A single boot print, clear and recent, sat inches from a reddish smear staining the dust. Chloe's eyes followed the smear toward a pile of broken branches, and when she brushed them aside, she uncovered a bent metal snare, its cable frayed and twisted at the locking mechanism. Her heart stuttered. Trapping mountain lions was illegal in most of Utah, and certainly in protected canyonlands like this. Illegal trapping didn't just threaten wildlife, it fed bigger industries, exotic sales, trophy trades, trafficking. She had read enough investigative journalism to know the signs, though she never expected to find them in her own backyard. The thought of such cruelty existing this close to her home left her nauseated. A sudden clatter snapped her attention upward. Somewhere close, too close, metal scraped against stone. The cub crouched low, trembling. Chloe pulled it gently behind a large juniper trunk and listened. The canyon amplified every echo, but this sound wasn't part of the wind or shifting rocks. It was deliberate, slowly dragging, adjusting, a metallic whine like a trap being reset or gear being lifted. Her pulse hammered in her throat. She peeked around the tree, scanning the boulders above the clearing. At first, she saw nothing. Then movement, a shadow sliding behind a rock outcrop. Human, tall, carrying something slung across one shoulder. The figure paused briefly, shifting weight, then disappeared behind the ridge. Chloe ducked back into hiding, her breath coming fast. The cub let out a stifled cry, muffled by the fur pressing against her leg. She stroked its head to quiet it, though fear tightened her own chest. Whoever was up there had not left, and they weren't alone. As she strained to listen, she caught the faint rise and fall of voices. Two men. Their words blurred together, but the tone was unmistakably irritated, heated. She made out fragments when the wind shifted. Tracks. Cub. Mother. Get it before. The rest was swallowed by the canyon walls. Chloe's stomach dropped. They were talking about the cub, about its mother, about finishing something. She felt her hands tremble, realizing she was not only in the wrong place, but in the most dangerous place imaginable. And still the cub looked at her with those desperate, shining eyes, urging her onward. It needed her. More than anything, it needed someone who wasn't trying to hurt it. She forced herself to steady her breath. She couldn't confront anyone. She couldn't reveal she was here. She needed to stay quiet, stay hidden, and get information. The canyon offered limited routes, but she remembered from old maps that there was a narrow side path, a switchback trail leading down toward a rock corridor. If the cub's mother was hurt, she might be somewhere below, where animals sometimes sought shade during the hottest parts of summer. The cub limped toward that path now, casting terrified glances behind them. Chloe followed, careful to muffle her steps as they descended. The voices above faded, but did not disappear completely. A constant reminder, a looming threat. As they reached the bottom of the switchback, she saw the corridor open into a tight ravine, its floor littered with cracked stones. Fresh paw prints dotted the dust, larger ones, uneven and scattered, the tracks of an adult lion in distress. The cub hurried ahead and cried out, the sound bouncing painfully off the canyon walls. Chloe felt dread pool in her stomach. They were close. The truth, whatever awful form it took, was somewhere in this ravine. The harm that drove this young cub to her porch was no longer an abstract puzzle. It was a living danger carved into the red dust, waiting just beyond the next turn. And with each step, Chloe understood. She wasn't just following the cub anymore. She was walking straight into someone else's design, someone who had already shown exactly what they were capable of. The ravine narrowed until Chloe and the cub were forced to walk single file, their shoulders brushing against sandstone walls warm from the sun. The air here felt trapped, heavy with dust and something sharper beneath it, something metallic that clung to the back of her throat. Each breath reminded her she was deeper into the canyon than she had ever meant to go. The cub moved faster now despite its limp, driven by a mix of fear and instinct that made Chloe's heart tighten. Whatever lay ahead, it wasn't simply danger. It was urgency. It was family. The passage curved sharply, and Chloe slowed as a faint sound drifted toward them, an unsteady, rasping exhale that echoed like a sigh from deep inside the earth. The cub froze first. Its small body stiffened before it let out a trembling cry, a sound so mournful it made Chloe's blood turn cold. She stepped forward and peered around the bend. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. Below the lip of a broken rock shelf, halfway down a narrow drop, lay a full-grown mountain lion. The mother? Her tawny coat was dulled by dust and streaked with dark patches where her skin had torn against stone. A steel snare dug deep into the flesh around her torso, the braided cable wrapped so tightly she could barely draw breath. The ground beneath her was scraped raw, the marks of an animal that had fought until her strength collapsed. Her sides rose and fell in shallow, uneven movements, each one slower than the last. And beside her, huddled close for what little comfort they could find, were two smaller cubs, barely older than the one who had led Chloe here. For a moment, Chloe couldn't move. She couldn't even think. The cruelty of the scene was so stark, so violently wrong, that her mind refused to accept it. The little cub at her feet cried again, louder, rawer, and Chloe felt the sound like a physical wound. She slid carefully down the rocks, ignoring the sting of stone scraping her palms. When she reached the ledge just above the trapped lioness, the mother's golden eyes flicked open. Weak as she was, she lifted her head a fraction, not in threat, but in recognition. This was the human who came with her missing cub, the only one who had come at all. "It's okay," Chloe whispered, though her voice trembled. "I'm here. I'm going to help you." The words came out in a rush, the same words she might offer a scared neighbor or a lost child, the same calm tone she had once used working in healthcare before burnout pushed her toward a quieter life. But nothing about this moment felt quiet. It felt like standing in the middle of someone else's emergency, someone who couldn't call 911 or search online for help or file a claim with an insurance provider. This mother had only her cubs. And now, somehow, she had Chloe. She reached toward the snare cautiously, her fingers brushing cold steel slick with dust. The mechanism was old but sturdy, the type used by people who didn't care about regulations or animal welfare. The locking cam was wedged so deep into the lioness's fur that Chloe couldn't even see the release point. She tugged gently at the cable, but the lioness flinched violently, letting out a low, pained rumble that tore through Chloe's chest. I know, I'm sorry," Chloe whispered, fighting the rising panic in her throat. She looked around desperately for anything that could give her leverage. A fallen branch, a rock, anything? But all she saw were the same signs she'd been finding all morning: broken brush, tools dropped in haste, footprints that circled like wolves closing in. Whoever set this trap hadn't just hurt this lioness. They had expected to come back. A sudden clang echoed from above, sharp and jarring. Chloe's head snapped upward. The cubs froze. The lioness's ears twitched weakly. Someone was nearby. She crawled up the rock shelf just enough to peek over the edge. Through a slit in the canyon wall, she saw movement, shadows crossing the ridge where she'd spotted the men earlier. The murmur of voices drifted toward her again, clearer now. One of them laughed, a sound so careless it made her skin crawl. "We'll check the ravine next," a man said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Chloe's stomach plunged. They were coming here, to this exact place, and if they found her kneeling beside the trapped lioness, with the injured cub pressed into her side like a frightened child, they wouldn't see a concerned hiker. They would see a witness. She scrambled back down to the cubs, her breath catching in her throat. "We have to keep quiet," she whispered, though she knew they couldn't understand. Still, the cubs huddled together, their small bodies shaking in terrified silence. She touched the mother lion again, softer this time, as if promising she would return. The men's footsteps crunched closer. Chloe looked around wildly, searching for any nook or shadow that could hide her. There, a narrow split between two boulders, barely wide enough for her to squeeze into. She herded the cubs gently toward it, guiding them into the shadows. Then she pressed her back against the stone, heart pounding so hard she felt it in her teeth. Silence descended slowly, then broke with the scrape of boots on gravel. A man's voice drifted down the ravine. "The snare should have held her. Tracks end here. She didn't go far." Another answered, annoyed. "Then find her, before anyone else does." Chloe swallowed hard. Anyone else. They weren't just hunters. They were hiding something. Something tied to the cameras, the bait, the organized pattern she had stumbled into. She listened to them descend partway into the ravine, their footsteps stopping frighteningly close. One man kicked a loose stone off the ledge, and it clattered down just feet from the mother lion. The lioness trembled but made no sound. Chloe held her breath until spots burst in front of her eyes. Minutes felt like hours before the footsteps retreated, and their voices faded into the canyon above. Chloe waited until the hush returned, until she could trust her own breath again. Only then did she crawl from the crevice and move back toward the lioness. The cubs cried softly as she knelt beside them, leaning close to the mother's face. "They'll be back," she whispered, "and I can't move you alone. I need help. Real help." Her phone still had no signal, but she knew what she had to do. She had to leave, climb high, call for rescue, and she had to do it fast before the men returned. She touched the lioness's paw gently, a promise forming even as fear pushed at her spine. "Hold on. I'm not leaving you. I'm just getting help." The lioness blinked slowly as though she understood. And as Chloe gathered the trembling cub who had led her here, she felt the canyon shift around her, the weight of danger, the urgency of time, and the fragile thread of hope that bound them all together as she prepared to climb toward the only chance they had left. Chloe moved quickly, though every step felt as if the canyon floor might crumble beneath her. The injured cub clung close, brushing her leg with each limping stride. Behind them, the trapped lioness lay half-hidden in shadow, her shallow breaths fading into the heat of the afternoon. Chloe forced herself not to look back again. If she hesitated, if she faltered even for a moment, the men she'd heard above the ravine would return, and this time they would not walk past. They would find her, and the lioness, and the cubs. The thought made her skin prickle with fear. The narrow path upward was steep and uneven, carved through sandstone that flaked under her hands. She climbed anyway, gripping every ledge she could reach. The cub struggled behind her, slipping twice before she scooped it gently into her arms. Its small body trembled against her chest as she pushed onward, scrambling toward higher ground, where she prayed her phone might catch a signal. The faint hum of wind echoed through the canyon, but beneath it she thought she heard something else. An engine turning over, a rumble swelling, then fading. Not thunder. An ATV. She climbed faster. When she reached a flat shelf halfway to the ridge, she set the cub down so it could rest. Her lungs burned, her heartbeat thudded loud enough she feared the men above would hear it. She pulled her phone from her pocket with shaking hands. Still no bars, not even a flicker. The canyon walls were too tight, too tall. She needed the open sky. Behind her, the cub whimpered. Chloe knelt beside it, brushing dust from its fur. "We're almost there," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. "Stay close to me." A sudden crack echoed from above, a boot snapping a dry branch. The cub stiffened. Chloe whipped her head up toward the ridgeline. The shadows shifted. A voice drifted down. "She's not far. Tracks head this way." Chloe froze. The cub pressed itself against her ankle. Another voice joined the first, rough and irritated. "Well, she didn't just vanish. The snare didn't kill her, so she's dragging herself somewhere. Look for the fresh sign." They were talking about the mother lion. Her pulse surged painfully. She scanned the rock around her, searching for anything, any cavity, any low ledge, to hide in until they passed. But this shelf was exposed, a flat stretch of stone with only a few scattered junipers bending in the wind. If she stayed here, they would see her the moment they looked down. She lifted the cub gently into her arms again and made a decision she'd regret if it went wrong. She climbed, leaving the relative safety of the shelf and pushing herself toward the last steep incline that led to open air. The sandstone burned the palms of her hands, and once she slipped, sending loose stones skittering down the slope. The noise echoed through the canyon like a flare. She froze, breath locking in her throat. The voices stopped. Then one of the men said, "You hear that?" Boots clattered across rock. Fast. Chloe clutched the cub to her chest and nearly ran the final stretch. The incline opened suddenly onto a higher plateau, a flat expanse of sunlit stone and sparse brush. She stumbled forward and immediately pulled out her phone. One bar blinked faintly, flickered, then vanished. She held the phone higher, stepping toward the edge of the plateau, searching the sky as if she could pull a signal down with her bare hands. "Please," she begged silently, "just one bar, 1 second, one chance." A single bar returned, wavering weakly. She didn't hesitate. She tapped 911, her thumb shaking so violently she nearly hit the wrong numbers. The phone rang once, then twice, then a voice. "911, what's your emergency?" Relief rushed through her so powerfully she nearly lost her balance. "My name is Chloe Warren," she said, her voice trembling. "There's an injured mountain lion, 3 cubs, illegal snares, men with gear. They're coming back, Dead Mare Canyon. I need wildlife rescue, law enforcement, anyone you can send. Please, hurry." The operator started to speak again. "Ma'am, can you confirm?" The call dropped. The signal died completely. Chloe stared at the blank screen, her breath shaking. But they had heard her, at least part of it, enough to send help, hopefully. Before she could think further, an engine snarled in the distance. The sound grew rapidly louder. She spun around just as a black ATV crested a rise on the far side of the plateau, the machine grinding over stone, sending dust spiraling into the hot summer air. 2 men rode it, one driving, one standing slightly behind him with a long metal pole in his grip, a capture pole, or something worse. The man in back spotted her first. "There!" he shouted. The ATV accelerated. Chloe grabbed the cub and ran. The ground was rough beneath her boots, sloping downward toward a cluster of junipers that might offer cover. The cub clung to her shirt, its small claws gripping fabric instead of skin, only by luck. The ATV roared behind her, engine straining, tires scraping rock. She could hear the men yelling, orders, curses, something about the witness. Her chest burned, her legs screamed, but she didn't stop. The plateau narrowed into a drop-off where wind gusted upward in scorching bursts. To her right, a fractured boulder split open into a crevice barely wide enough to squeeze through. She didn't have time to weigh her options. She darted into the crevice, pressing her back against one wall with the cub pressed tightly to her chest. The ATV skidded to a halt somewhere above. Boots hit the ground. Heavy footsteps approached. "She ran this way," one man growled. "I saw her." "Well, then find her," the other snapped. "The cub's got to be with her, and if she called anybody—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Chloe held her breath until her lungs ached. The cub didn't make a sound. Its small body trembled against her, but it stayed silent, trusting her in a way she didn't fully understand. The men searched the plateau, kicking through brush, cursing every few seconds. Their shadows passed near the crevice entrance. For one terrifying moment, Chloe saw a hand reach toward the gap where she hid. But then a radio crackled from the ATV, pulling their attention away. "Come on," one man muttered. "We'll sweep the ravine again. She can't stay hidden forever." Their footsteps retreated. The engine revved. The ATV growled back toward the canyon's mouth. Chloe waited until the sound faded completely before she let herself breathe. The relief made her knees weak. She leaned her head back against the stone, eyes burning, heart pounding so hard it felt like a drum in her chest. They had almost caught her, and if they had... She pushed the thought away. Gently, she lifted the cub, checking its paws, its breathing. It blinked up at her with wide, exhausted eyes, as if asking whether the danger was over. She shook her head. "We're not safe yet," she whispered. "But help is coming. I just need to get back to your mother before they do." The cub pressed its forehead to her chest in the smallest gesture of trust she had ever seen. Chloe tightened her grip on it, stepped out of the crevice, and turned toward the canyon where the lioness still lay trapped. She didn't know what waited between here and there, whether the men had doubled back, whether the snares were still hidden in the brush, whether time was already running out. But she knew one truth with absolute, unshakable clarity. She would not let that family die. The canyon was quieter than before. Too quiet, Chloe thought, as she made her way back down the winding trail toward the ravine. The cub clung to her shirt, its breathing still uneven from the chase, but its eyes remained fixed ahead with a determination that pushed her forward. The sun had shifted west, casting long shadows across the stone, and the heat pressed against her skin like a warning. Time was slipping. The lioness didn't have much left. She reached the narrow switchback and descended carefully, her boots scraping on loose gravel. Every sound seemed louder now, the rustle of dry brush, the faint groan of rock as the canyon warmed, the distant hum of wind sweeping through the red cliffs. She listened constantly for the ATV, for voices, for any sign the men had returned. But the canyon held its breath, as though waiting with her. When she reached the ravine floor again, the cub wriggled out of her arms and hurried ahead, crying softly. Chloe followed quickly, rounding the sharp bend, and felt her heart crack at the sight before her. The lioness was still alive, but barely. Her breaths were shallower now, her sides moving only slightly. The two cubs at her flank lifted their heads weakly when they heard their sibling return. Chloe knelt beside the mother, laying one hand gently along her cheek. The lioness blinked once, a slow, heavy movement, as if fighting to stay awake long enough to understand that help might truly be coming. "I'm back," Chloe whispered, her voice breaking. "Hold on, okay? Please, hold on." Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, a faint vibration, nothing more. She pulled it out, desperately hoping for a signal, but the screen remained blank. Still, that vibration meant something. It meant the emergency call had gone through far enough for the network to try reconnecting. Someone out there might already be looking for her. For them. She clung to that thought as she studied the snare again. If she could loosen the mechanism, even a little, it might buy the lioness more time. She dug her fingers under the twisted cable. It cut into her skin, but she kept pulling. The lioness shuddered with each tug, yet she didn't lash out. She stayed still, trusting Chloe in the way only an animal pushed to its limits could. Chloe braced her foot against a stone and pulled harder until her muscles trembled. The cable didn't budge. It had been set by someone who intended to return and claim whatever they'd caught. Bootsteps echoed faintly above the canyon. Chloe stiffened. Her hands slipped from the snare. The cubs froze. She pressed herself low against the stone, listening, waiting. The bootsteps faded, and then new sounds broke through the silence. Engines, multiple. Not the harsh snarl of the ATV, but deeper, controlled, familiar. Government vehicles, rescue trucks, rangers. She scrambled up to the ledge, gripping the rock with both hands. Dust swirled as a white truck crested the ridge on the far side of the canyon, followed by a second and third. She saw the green stripe of a wildlife service vehicle. Relief burst through her so swiftly she almost collapsed. "They're here," she whispered to the cub at her feet. "They're really here." A moment later, a voice boomed from above, amplified by the canyon walls. "Ma'am, this is Utah Wildlife Resources. Can you hear me?" Chloe stood and waved both arms. "Down here," she shouted. "She's trapped. The mother lion, she's hurt. Please hurry." Within minutes, a coordinated team descended the canyon with precision that made Chloe's vision blur with gratitude. Two wildlife officers reached her first, their faces shifting from concern to shock when they saw the lioness and her cubs. They spoke calmly, giving commands to one another, assessing the scene with practiced eyes. One officer knelt beside the lioness, checking her breathing, while another scanned the ravine walls with binoculars. "Tracks of two men heading north," he reported. Looks like law enforcement will intercept them at the service road." Chloe exhaled shakily. Finally. A veterinarian approached next, carrying a tranquilizer kit, ropes, and cutting tools. She knelt beside the lioness, speaking in a soft, low voice. Chloe stepped back only when instructed, though the cubs clung to her legs until gentle hands lifted them into padded carriers. "It's okay," Chloe whispered to them. "They're helping. You're safe now." When the vet cut through the snare, the lioness let out one long, trembling sigh, half relief, half release from agony. Her head lowered onto the soft sand, and her breathing began to steady under the sedative. The vet looked up at Chloe with a mixture of astonishment and gratitude. "If you hadn't found her today," she said quietly, "she wouldn't have made it through the night." The words hit Chloe harder than expected. She felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the staggering weight of everything that had led her here. The cub crying on her porch, the chase through the canyon, the hiding, the fear. And now this fragile, precious moment of rescue. A moment that might never have come if not for the tiny creature that had placed its paw on her arm that morning. Hours passed in a blur of coordinated movement. The lioness and her cubs were secured, loaded into rescue carriers, and lifted gently into transport trucks. Officers documented tracks, collected the illegal snare, and photographed the disturbed clearing as evidence. Chloe answered every question they asked, though her voice wavered with exhaustion. By the time she climbed into the back seat of a ranger truck to be driven home, the sun had begun to set, painting the canyon in ribbons of orange light. The cub who had led her here watched from its carrier as the truck door closed, its blue-gray eyes following her with something that looked almost like understanding. When the ranger pulled up to her cabin, the sky had deepened into soft rose. The porch looked exactly as she had left it, the cooled coffee mug, the quiet chair, the stillness. But Chloe felt different stepping out of the truck. She felt changed in a way she couldn't name yet. The ranger thanked her again before driving away, leaving her in the warm summer dusk. For a moment she simply stood there, breathing in the scent of juniper and dust, feeling the enormity of the day settle around her. Weeks passed. The lioness underwent surgery, recovered slowly, and gained back her strength under the care of specialists. The 3 cubs grew rapidly, learning to climb and stalk playfully in the rehabilitation enclosure designed to give them confidence before release. Chloe visited them often, bringing blankets, approved toys, and quiet company. She became well known to the staff, who smiled when the smallest cub scampered toward her every time she approached the enclosure fence. And then, one bright morning in late summer, she received an invitation to witness their release. She arrived at the forest clearing with a mixture of nerves and awe. The transport carriers were lined up in the shade of tall pines. A gentle wind rustled through the brush, carrying the earthy scent of sun-warmed cedar. When the vet gave the signal, the doors opened. The cubs burst out first, 3 streaks of energy bounding into the wild, their paws kicking up dust that shimmered in the golden light. The lioness stepped out next, slower, stronger, her coat sleek again, her eyes alert and proud. She stood tall for a moment, breathing in the air of her canyon home. Then she turned. Her gaze found Chloe across the clearing, not fearful, not uncertain, simply present, steady, and impossibly deep. A silent acknowledgement, a thank you without words. And just before the lioness disappeared into the red forest, the smallest cub, her first visitor, her unexpected messenger, paused. It looked back at Chloe and let out a single soft sound, almost like the cry she'd heard that morning on her porch, but this one carried no fear, only recognition. Then it bounded after its family, vanishing into the trees. Chloe stood alone in the warm summer light, her heart full. She understood in a quiet and certain way that something profound had passed between them, something that tied her forever to the canyon and its wild inhabitants. A reminder of the fragile lives that depended on people willing to step forward, even when the path was uncertain. And somewhere beyond the tree line, in the ancient hush of the red forest, a family of mountain lions disappeared into their rightful world, free, alive, and whole again.